The sun beat down relentlessly on Cemetery Ridge, casting long shadows over the fallen soldiers. Surrounded, outnumbered, and with no reinforcements in sight, Custer knew that his gamble had failed. What had begun as a bold strike into the heart of the Sioux and Cheyenne camp was now unraveling into chaos, and the Seventh Cavalry's storied reputation was about to be shattered. But the battle didn't start here. It began long before, with a decision made in haste, a message misunderstood, and the quiet, patient mobilization of warriors who had been underestimated. As Custer faced the end, he couldn't help but wonder, where did it all go wrong? This is not just the story of his last stand. It is the story of a battle lost long before the first shot was fired. And now, as the weight of his fateful choices pressed down as heavily as the unforgiving sun, Custer's thoughts drifted through the haze of battle to the moments that had led him and his men here to this final stand on Cemetery Ridge. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Its relentless heat bore down on Custer's men, adding to the oppressive weight of the situation. Sweat trickled down their faces, mixing with the dust that clung to their uniforms, giving them a weary, ghostly appearance. The horses, restless and exhausted, shifted nervously, their hooves digging into the dry, cracked earth beneath them. Every soldier knew what was coming, and the silence among them was heavy, only punctuated by the far-off sounds of gunfire, the dying echoes of earlier skirmishes. On Cemetery Ridge, the last stronghold of Custer's command, a group of men, fewer now than just hours before, stood scattered, rifles held tight in their trembling hands. Their eyes darted across the horizon, searching for any sign of hope, for the reinforcements that had been promised but had never arrived. George Armstrong Custer, once so confident, stood at the ridge's edge, his eyes scanning the distant plains with a mixture of defiance and despair. The famed cavalry officer, whose bravado had led him through countless battles, now faced the reality of his final stand. Far below, the valley stretched out like an empty stage, though it was anything but. The Native American warriors, mere shadows at first, were now fully visible, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors moved with purpose, their figures weaving through the landscape, closing in from all sides. The once distant shouts of war cries grew louder, echoing up toward the ridge, accompanied by the thundering of hooves. Arrows began to fly, some landing harmlessly, others striking horses or men with sickening precision. Custer could see the panic spreading through his ranks. The soldiers were outnumbered, outflanked, and exhausted. Custer clenched his jaw. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. His men were trapped, encircled by warriors whose numbers seemed endless, cutting off every possible avenue of escape. He turned to his left, hoping to spot a miracle on the horizon, the sight of Benteen's column charging in to relieve the pressure. But there was nothing, only the sun dipping closer to the horizon, casting a harsh glow on the carnage that was unfolding. The cavalrymen had held out hope for Benteen's arrival, clinging to the belief that they would not be abandoned. Custer had sent the orders, his urgent request for support, hours ago, but no help had come. Whether it was a delay, a misunderstanding, or simply impossible for Benteen to reach them, it no longer mattered. The gap between Custer's troops and salvation had grown too wide. A cold realization settled over the men as they grasped the futility of their situation. Amidst the chaos, the sound of gunfire grew louder, sharper, more frequent. Custer's men, still holding their position along Cemetery Ridge, fired sporadically, the bullets cutting through the dust-filled air. Each shot was a last, desperate act of resistance, aimed at an enemy they could barely see through the haze. In the distance, dark figures moved swiftly, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors closing the distance with terrifying speed. Their movements were fluid, calculated, darting between the cover of rocks, low brush, and the riverbanks. They were patient, unlike the soldiers, who were firing blindly into the mass of advancing warriors. The ridge offered little protection, and Custer's men, once a formidable force, were being slowly picked apart. Horses reared in fear as arrows whistled through the air, some finding their mark in the soft hides of the cavalry's steeds, sending them into panicked fits. Soldiers scrambled to hold their positions, but the line was faltering. Bodies began to litter the ground, fallen comrades and horses lying motionless in the sun's harsh glare. Custer stood in the center of it all, his eyes sweeping across the battlefield. For the first time, the weight of his decisions bore down on him fully. He had led his men here, into this trap, and now they were paying the price. His fabled confidence, the same that had carried him through countless skirmishes and campaigns, faltered in the face of this overwhelming reality. There would be no glory in this final fight, no last-minute heroics to turn the tide. The cavalry that had once seemed invincible was crumbling under the relentless pressure of an enemy they had gravely underestimated. Another volley of bullets rang out, followed by the cries of men as they fell. The warriors were closing in now, their silhouettes clearer with each passing moment. Custer could see them, darting from one cover to the next, their numbers growing with each glance. The once scattered warriors were now fully assembled, their battle cries ringing out over the ridge as they prepared to make their final push. A bullet whistled past Custer's ear, snapping him back to the immediate danger. He turned to face his remaining soldiers, those who were still standing, still fighting, despite the hopelessness of it all. They had been with him through thick and thin, through victories and defeats, and now, in their final moments, they looked to him one last time. His men, once full of life and bravado, were now weary, beaten down by the sheer scale of the battle that had consumed them. The gunfire was unrelenting. Men were falling around him, their cries echoing across the ridge, but there was no time to grieve. Custer's gaze hardened as he tightened his grip on his rifle. He knew this was the end. There would be no reinforcements, no miraculous save. The Seventh Cavalry's story was ending here, in this desolate valley, surrounded by an enemy they had grossly underestimated. Custer took a deep breath, his final orders hanging on his lips. The sound of hooves and war cries grew louder as the warriors closed in. The end was near, and he knew it, but he would face it, rifle in hand, surrounded by the men who had followed him to the very end. As Custer stood amidst the chaos, the echoes of gunfire ringing in his ears, his mind couldn't help but drift back to the critical decision that had set all of this in motion. It seemed like only hours ago, but the weight of that moment had grown heavier with each passing minute, each fallen soldier. The image of Medicine Tail Ford flashed vividly in his mind, the moment when he could have turned back, when things might have gone differently. The scene had been eerily calm compared to the violence now engulfing Cemetery Ridge. Earlier that day, as Custer had stood overlooking Medicine Tail Ford, he could see the scattered resistance of the Native American warriors. They were few in number then, firing sporadically at his troops from across the Little Bighorn River. The village lay just beyond, a sprawling expanse of lodges and teepees, with smoke rising lazily from the hearths. At first glance, it seemed the warriors were retreating, and for a brief moment, Custer thought he might have caught them off guard. He could see them fleeing toward the western hills, their figures small and distant. He turned to his officers, his hand sweeping toward the village. "There, beyond the ford," he said, "we can cut them off if we move swiftly." His voice carried the same confidence that had seen them through countless engagements before, the kind of confidence that had built his reputation. But even as he spoke, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The village stretched farther than he had initially thought, continuing north down the valley for hundreds of yards. He realized then that this was no small encampment. This was a massive force of Sioux and Cheyenne, far larger than anticipated. Custer stood on the bluff, weighing his options. Crossing at Medicine Tail Ford no longer seemed viable. There were too many unknowns, too many warriors moving in the distance. His instinct told him it would be futile, like chasing shadows in a landscape that stretched endlessly ahead. He glanced back at his men, at the tired faces of soldiers who had ridden hard for days. A single crossing here would accomplish little. They needed to strike deeper, cut off the heart of the village, and corral the warriors into a retreat they couldn't recover from. It was in that moment, when he saw the full scope of the village and realized the immensity of the native forces, that he made his decision. He would move north, skirting the village to find a crossing further downstream. It would be a bolder maneuver, riskier, but if successful, it would allow him to flank the retreating warriors and strike at the core of their encampment. He had sent word to Captain Keogh and Yates, relaying his plan, trusting them to follow through. They had all fought together for years, and if anyone could execute this daring maneuver, it was his trusted officers. Yet deep down, he knew the risk. He knew that the further north he moved, the farther he would be from any support. His regiment was stretched thin, split into multiple columns, and the gap between them was widening with every passing hour. Benteen, back with the slower-moving column, had been ordered to hurry. But even then, Custer knew it would be a race against time. There was no guarantee that Benteen could reach them in time if the situation turned sour. But Custer, ever the gambler, chose to place his faith in speed and surprise. At 3:05 p.m., with his rear guarded by Smith's troopers, Custer made his move. His command descended from the bluff and into Deep Coulee, crossing its broad flats and setting off toward what would later be called Finley Finkel Ridge. He knew the risks, but the possibility of a decisive strike outweighed the dangers in his mind. His men moved with purpose, though there was a noticeable tension in the air. Even the horses seemed to sense the uncertainty, their movements jerky and uneasy. The soldiers advanced, their rifles at the ready, scanning the terrain ahead. Custer rode at the front, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where the river and village twisted into the landscape like a mirage. The skirmishes near Medicine Tail Ford had been sharp but scattered, not nearly enough to dissuade him from his course. In Custer's mind, the battle was far from lost. He believed he still held the advantage, that a bold push would scatter the remaining warriors and force them into retreat. But as they moved deeper into enemy territory, the firing grew heavier. From the scattered resistance at the ford, the battle was beginning to coalesce into something far more dangerous. Custer could see the warriors gathering in greater numbers now, their movements less frantic, more coordinated, and yet he pressed on, convinced that speed was the key. It was a risk, but one he felt was necessary. He trusted that Keogh and Yates would hold the high ground behind him, covering his rear as they had done so many times before. Little did he know, as he pushed forward, that this decision, the choice to move north, to chase victory at the cost of safety, would be the one that sealed his fate. Back on Cemetery Ridge, as the warriors closed in, Custer's mind flickered again to another critical moment, a fleeting memory of Myles Keogh. It had been Keogh who was tasked with holding the high ground, Keogh, whose skirmish line had been their last hope of maintaining some semblance of order as they pressed northward. As Custer stood facing his end, he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Keogh's line, what had gone wrong. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on Captain Myles Keogh's shoulders as he led his men to the high ridge known as Nye Cartwright, the natural vantage point that Custer had ordered him to hold. It was just past 3 p.m., and Keogh's men, tired from the long ride but still sharp, positioned themselves with precision, rifles raised, eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the advancing enemy. Keogh had always trusted his instincts, and those instincts now screamed that something was off. Though the fighting had begun in earnest down by the river near Medicine Tail Ford, it was the eerie quiet here on the ridge that unnerved him. The silence, however, was short-lived. The first shots rang out not long after they reached their position, sharp cracks in the distance, followed by the faint cries of warriors. Keogh immediately ordered his men into a skirmish line, a formation designed to spread out the soldiers and offer a better defense against what he suspected was an oncoming assault. His men moved swiftly and efficiently, setting up their positions across the ridge. Keogh knew they had one advantage, the high ground. It was a crucial element in battle, giving his troops a better view of the terrain below and offering them a clear shot at any enemy who dared approach. From their vantage point, they could see the broad valley stretching out toward the Little Bighorn River, where Custer had pressed further north with Yates and Smith. The sounds of war echoed from the distance, faint at first, but growing louder by the minute. Keogh's eyes darted across the landscape, searching for any sign of the approaching enemy. He knew they were out there. Custer had spotted them earlier, and reports had come in of warriors gathering at various points along the river. Keogh had no illusions about the scale of the threat they faced. The warriors were not the scattered, fleeing masses Custer had hoped for. They were regrouping, organizing, and preparing for a counterattack. As the minutes ticked by, Keogh's anxiety grew. His men were tense, but they held their positions well, their carbines at the ready. Suddenly, movement caught his eye. A flicker of shadow along the river's edge, then another and another. The warriors were advancing, slowly at first, using the terrain to their advantage, hiding behind rocks and sagebrush. Keogh's pulse quickened. He knew this was just the beginning. "Hold steady," Keogh called out, his voice carrying across the ridge. His men braced themselves, watching as the enemy slowly but steadily closed the distance. Shots rang out, sporadic at first, but growing more frequent as the warriors moved closer. Arrows soon followed, slicing through the air with a deadly hiss. One of the men near the front stumbled, clutching his side as an arrow pierced his uniform. The skirmish line was under attack, and Keogh's instincts told him it would only get worse. The sun, still high in the sky, cast long shadows over the battlefield as the warriors began their assault in earnest. They were relentless, darting forward, firing, and then retreating back into the safety of the ravines and coulees that dotted the landscape. From his position on the ridge, Keogh could see them clearly, but shooting them was another matter. They were skilled in using the terrain to their advantage, never staying in one place for long, always moving, always advancing. Keogh turned to his second-in-command, a seasoned soldier with a grim look on his face. "We need to hold this line," Keogh said, his voice low but firm. "If we don't, Custer's cut off, and we're done for." The officer nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. They had been ordered to hold this ridge at all costs, to provide covering fire for Custer as he moved northward. But now, with the warriors advancing in greater numbers, Keogh began to realize just how precarious their position was. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and slowly being surrounded. More warriors appeared on the horizon, their numbers swelling as they moved like a wave toward Keogh's skirmish line. His men fired at will, but it was becoming clear that they were losing ground. The warriors were relentless, their movements coordinated, their attacks calculated. Keogh's men were brave, but they were tiring, and the enemy was closing in. For a moment, Keogh allowed himself to think of Benteen. If Benteen had arrived by now, maybe there would still be hope. Maybe they could hold the ridge long enough for reinforcements to push the enemy back. But as he looked down the valley, he saw no sign of Benteen's column. There was only dust and the shimmer of heat rising from the ground. The sounds of battle were growing louder by the second, and Keogh knew they were running out of time. "Stay sharp," he called out, his voice carrying over the din of gunfire. His men responded with a final, concentrated volley, but it was clear that the enemy was not slowing down. Keogh glanced one last time in the direction of Custer's advance. There was nothing to see, no help on the way. He turned back to his men, watching as the line began to falter, knowing that their hold on the ridge was slipping away. The night before the battle had been one of restless anticipation. In the dim light of the officers' tents, Custer had gathered his key men, Keogh, Yates, and Smith among them, to outline his strategy. The smell of campfires and horses filled the air as the officers sat around, listening intently to the man they had followed into countless engagements before. Custer had a reputation for daring, for charging headfirst into situations that other commanders might approach with caution. But that night, as he spoke, the tone was different. He laid out the map of the Little Bighorn River, tracing the village they would soon face with his finger. It stretched farther than any of them had imagined. A formidable encampment filled with Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Intelligence had suggested the village was large, but even Custer seemed surprised at its scale. Still, there was confidence in his voice as he addressed his officers, a sense of inevitability in his belief that they would carry the day. The Seventh Cavalry had faced overwhelming odds before, and in Custer's mind, this would be no different. "We'll split the regiment," he said, his voice commanding the room. "Reno will take his men down the valley and attack from the south. We'll push through the middle, and Benteen will sweep in from the other side. If all goes according to plan, we'll catch them off guard, surround them, and force them to retreat." The officers nodded in agreement. though there was an unspoken tension in the room. They all understood the risks involved, the possibility of something going wrong. But they trusted Custer. He had led them through countless battles, always with a calculated mix of boldness and precision. If anyone could pull this off, it was him. Keogh, ever the pragmatist, raised a question, his brow furrowed in thought. What if they're more organized than we expect? There's a chance their numbers could be higher than anticipated, and we don't know how many warriors might join them once the fighting starts. Custer's face remained impassive, his gaze steady. We'll move fast enough that it won't matter, he said. The key is speed. We can't give them time to organize. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late. We'll have them on the run. The plan was simple but bold, relying heavily on timing and coordination. Custer believed that the sheer audacity of his strategy would be enough to catch the warriors off guard. But as the officers filed out of the tent that night, some of them couldn't shake the unease that settled in their stomachs. Keogh, in particular, felt the weight of what was to come. He knew that this battle would not be like the others. The terrain was different, the enemy more determined, but he trusted his commander, even when his instincts told him that the odds were steep. Custer, for his part, was undeterred. He had faced tougher situations before. He had led daring charges during the Civil War, outflanked enemies when others would have retreated, and gained a reputation as a fearless leader. His confidence radiated as he outlined each step of the plan. We'll divide them up, he repeated, as though reassuring not only his men, but himself. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late. As the officers left the tent to get what little sleep they could before the coming dawn, Custer remained behind, staring at the map laid out on the table. He traced his finger once more over the expanse of the village, already visualizing how the battle would unfold. He pictured the warriors retreating, overwhelmed by the force of his cavalry's charge. He could see them scattering as his men rode into the village, cutting off their escape and securing another victory for the Seventh Cavalry. But the victory he imagined would never come. What he couldn't foresee, what none of them could, was the scale of the resistance they would face. The warriors they believed would scatter would instead regroup and return in overwhelming numbers, surrounding the very forces that Custer had split. The plan, so bold in its conception, would ultimately lead to their downfall. But in that moment, as Custer stood over the map in the dim light of the tent, the battle ahead still felt like one they could win. The night passed quietly, the air heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. By morning, Custer and his men would be riding into what they believed would be just another battle in their long campaign. But as they prepared to ride out, the gravity of the situation began to settle on them, like a dark cloud they could not yet see. Back on the battlefield, Keogh's skirmish line was faltering. Custer's plan, so carefully laid out the night before, was unraveling before his eyes. The warriors were closing in, and Keogh's men were being pushed to the brink. As the chaos mounted, Custer could feel the grip of his earlier confidence slipping away, replaced by the cold reality of a battle that had gone terribly wrong. The memory of that fateful plan lingered in Custer's mind as the sounds of gunfire and the cries of his men pulled him back to the present. The battlefield around him was in disarray, his troops scattered, their once coordinated maneuvers reduced to chaos. But as he looked across the valley, he realized that the chaos was not shared by the enemy. The Native American warriors moved with a sense of purpose and coordination that belied their numbers. They had not scattered, they had returned, and they were coming for him. While Custer and his officers had planned their bold strike against the village, the Native American forces had also been preparing. The sun had barely risen over the valley when the first signs of movement began. Warriors from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes were already gathering, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. Unlike the soldiers who were confined to their rigid formations and orders, the warriors moved freely, communicating across vast distances with ease. They knew the land intimately, and they understood that this was a fight for survival. Word had spread quickly throughout the village that the soldiers were coming. It wasn't the first time the U.S. Army had tried to force them into submission, but this time The warriors were determined to fight back with all their might. Many of the warriors had initially stayed back, watching as the women, children, and elders fled the camp, moving further up the valley to safety. But once the non-combatants were secure, the warriors began to regroup and prepare for battle. The gathering of warriors was deliberate but far from chaotic. Low Dog, a respected Oglala Lakota leader, had rallied his men earlier that morning, telling them to wait for the right moment to strike. "We will fight when we are together," he had said, his voice carrying authority. "Do not go too soon. We must act as one." His words had been heeded, and now, as the soldiers of the Seventh Cavalry split their forces and advanced in separate directions, the warriors saw their opportunity. The first clash had come near Medicine Tail Ford, where a small group of warriors engaged Custer's men in a skirmish that was meant to delay rather than defeat. They fired from across the river, their shots sharp but scattered, enough to make the soldiers think they had the upper hand. It was a diversion, one that gave the main body of warriors time to organize, to gather their strength, and prepare for the real battle that was yet to come. As Custer and his men moved further north, the warriors began their counter-movement. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota war chief, led a group of warriors across the river, using the natural cover of the landscape to stay hidden. They moved swiftly, using the ravines, coulees, and rolling hills to shield themselves from the soldiers' view. Their plan was simple: let the soldiers advance, let them think they were winning, and then strike when they least expected it. The warriors on horseback galloped at full speed across the valley, their movements a blur of dust and shadow. From the soldiers' vantage point, they appeared like ghosts, moving in and out of the landscape as though they were part of it. From behind rocks and hills, they fired arrows and rifles, carefully targeting the soldiers' weak points. Gall's men moved with precision, knowing that every shot counted. Meanwhile, Sitting Bull, one of the most revered spiritual leaders of the Lakota, had stayed back, offering prayers and visions to guide his people in battle. He had foreseen this moment, the clash with Custer's forces, and had warned his people to be ready. His words had given the warriors strength, and now, as the battle unfolded, his presence could be felt even from a distance. By mid-afternoon, the warriors had swarmed across the river, their numbers now overwhelming. Hundreds of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters converged on the soldiers, coming at them from every direction. Gall had led the charge from the south, while warriors like Crazy Horse and Two Moons approached from the east and west, effectively surrounding Custer's forces. The soldiers, once confident in their superior firepower and tactics, now found themselves outmatched by the sheer number of warriors descending upon them. The landscape, which had seemed like an advantage earlier, was now a trap. Warriors used the gullies and ravines to dart forward, fire, and retreat before the soldiers could return fire effectively. Some warriors, on horseback, circled the soldiers at high speed, their war cries filling the air as they released volleys of arrows into the panicked ranks of the Seventh Cavalry. As the warriors advanced, they took full advantage of their intimate knowledge of the terrain. They knew the riverbanks, the hidden trails, and the safest paths through the valley. They had fought in these lands for generations, and their understanding of the battlefield far surpassed that of the soldiers, who were now trapped in a fight they hadn't anticipated. The wave of warriors crept ever closer, pressing the soldiers into tighter and tighter positions. Arrows flew through the air in a deadly arc, finding their marks with increasing frequency. Some of Custer's men had already been thrown into disarray, their ranks breaking as the warriors continued to press forward. The sight of warriors appearing on all sides, the horizon now filled with the figures of native fighters, made it clear to the soldiers that they were surrounded. The soldiers fired back, but their bullets seemed to disappear into the mass of warriors advancing from all directions. Custer, watching from his position, knew that his forces were outmatched. The warriors had outmaneuvered them, and what had started as a bold plan had now become a battle for survival. The ground beneath Custer's feet trembled as the warriors closed in. He could hear the distant rumble of hooves, the relentless advance of Gall's men coming from the south, and the cries of Crazy Horse's warriors to the west. The next moments would determine everything. The fight was no longer about victory, it was about survival, and Custer knew that his time was running out. Even as the warriors closed in from all sides, Custer's mind flashed back to the moment when everything might have been different, when he had sent that urgent message to Benteen, trusting that reinforcements were on the way. But something had gone wrong. There had been no sign of Benteen, no relief in sight, and now, surrounded on all sides, Custer understood the magnitude of that miscommunication, the missing piece that might have saved them all. Earlier in the day, as Custer's forces moved toward Medicine Tail Ford, the urgency of the situation had been palpable. The village was larger than anticipated, the warriors more numerous. Custer's command was spread out, with Reno already engaged in the valley below, and Benteen's battalion far behind, still catching up with the main force. The pressure to act quickly had driven Custer to his boldest, riskiest decision to push forward without waiting for Benteen's support. It was around 2:30 p.m. when Custer decided he needed Benteen and fast. He summoned his trusted aide, a young officer named Lieutenant William Cook, to deliver a message. The brief but fateful note, hastily scrawled on a scrap of paper, carried the weight of the battle itself. It read, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." Cook, the words conveyed urgency, but they failed to fully communicate the dire situation unfolding in the valley. Custer believed Benteen would understand the importance of speed. He had worked with him long enough to trust that Benteen would push his men hard, covering the distance quickly to provide the reinforcements Custer desperately needed. The plan had always hinged on speed to catch the village off guard, speed to defeat the warriors before they could regroup, and speed to link up with Benteen's column. But in that moment, Custer's need for haste blinded him to the complexities of the situation on the ground. Cook rode off, carrying the message, disappearing over the ridge toward Benteen's rearward position. For Custer, it was a moment of relief. The note was sent, the reinforcements would come, and all that remained was to push forward and seize the victory he envisioned. His mind was already on the next move, planning how his forces would converge on the village, how the warriors would be driven from the valley. But for Benteen, the reality was far more complicated. Benteen had been tasked with covering a broad stretch of territory, scouting to the left of Custer's main advance to ensure no warriors flanked them. His orders had been vague, and as the hours wore on, he became increasingly frustrated with the lack of clarity. He had heard distant gunfire, but it was sporadic, and there was no sign of immediate danger. The terrain was rough, slowing his progress as his men struggled through ravines and coulees. He had no idea that Custer had engaged the enemy in force, or that the situation had turned so critical. When Cook finally arrived with the message, Benteen's response was cautious. He understood the urgency, but the phrase "bring packs" left him uncertain. Did Custer need the ammunition packs for a full-scale battle? Or was this simply a standard call for supplies? The ambiguity of the message led to hesitation. Benteen weighed his options. He could rush ahead with his men, leaving the pack train behind, but what if Custer needed the supplies? The distance was considerable, and if his men arrived without the packs, they might be useless in a sustained fight. This brief moment of indecision, compounded by the exhaustion of his troops, proved to be critical. Benteen ordered his men to proceed at a steady pace, bringing the pack train along behind them. He still didn't know the extent of the fighting ahead, and without more information, he was unwilling to push his men too hard. Back on the battlefield, Custer had no way of knowing that his reinforcements were moving at a crawl. He had expected Benteen to charge in, to arrive in time to turn the tide of battle. But as the minutes stretched into hours, Custer's forces continued their push toward the village, growing increasingly isolated from the rest of the regiment. The warriors, who had initially seemed scattered and disorganized, began to regroup in large numbers. With each passing moment, the gap between Custer and Benteen widened, and the pressure on Custer's men mounted. By the time Benteen realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. As he approached Reno Hill, where Major Reno and his men had retreated after their own failed attack on the village, the sounds of heavy gunfire reached him. But instead of rushing forward to link up with Custer, Benteen was drawn into Reno's position, where the remnants of the battalion were regrouping after a fierce battle. There, on the hill, Benteen learned the full extent of what was happening. Custer had gone ahead, deeper into the valley, and now his forces were alone, facing the full might of the Native American warriors. Panic set in among the men, but Benteen knew there was no way to reach Custer in time. The terrain was too treacherous, the enemy too numerous. The miscommunication, the hesitation, had sealed Custer's fate. Benteen had done what he thought was best, but the delay was fatal. Custer, believing that Benteen was on his way, had pressed forward deeper into the valley, only to find himself outnumbered and overwhelmed. Now back on Cemetery Ridge, Custer's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for Benteen's arrival. But the ridge was empty. His reinforcements were not coming. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The message had failed. He was alone, and there would be no cavalry charge to save them now. As the grim realization of his isolation sank in, Custer's thoughts turned to one of the few civilians who had followed them into the valley, the war correspondent, Mark Kellogg. Custer had seen him earlier, trailing behind the troops on his mule, furiously scribbling notes and observing everything with an unwavering curiosity. Kellogg had come to document the victory that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of Custer's career. But now he was about to witness its tragic downfall. Mark Kellogg had always lived for the story. A seasoned journalist, he had covered battles, campaigns, and political events across the country. But nothing had intrigued him more than the chance to ride with Custer into the West. The Battle of Little Bighorn was supposed to be the story of a lifetime, the final chapter in the Indian Wars, and Kellogg wanted a front-row seat to witness history in the making. The ink from his pen, hastily scribbling notes on a small pad, had barely dried as he followed Custer's command into the valley. Riding a mule several yards behind the soldiers, Kellogg had kept his distance, observing the battle as it unfolded. His mind raced with excitement at what he believed would be a decisive victory for the U.S. Army. He imagined the headlines, Custer's triumph, and the chance to be the first to break the news of a complete rout of the Sioux and Cheyenne forces. But as the day wore on, and the skirmishes turned into a full-scale battle, Kellogg's excitement began to give way to unease. He had watched from a distance as Custer sent his battalion charging toward the village, the dust rising from the horses' hooves like a storm cloud. At first, it had seemed like any other engagement he had covered, a brief, violent skirmish followed by the inevitable retreat of the native forces. But this time, something was different. The warriors did not scatter. Instead, they returned in greater numbers, flanking Custer's men and firing from the cover of the terrain. The battle, which Kellogg had assumed would be over quickly, stretched on, the gunfire echoing through the valley. Kellogg, ever the observer, furiously jotted down notes as the battle unfolded. The soldiers, once confident and composed, now seemed disoriented. They had expected to overwhelm the Native American forces, but the situation had reversed. The warriors were now surrounding the troops, their war cries filling the air, accompanied by the sharp, deadly whiz of arrows and bullets. From his vantage point, Kellogg could see the chaos starting to spread through the ranks. He felt the first twinges of fear as the warriors drew closer. His journalistic instincts urged him to stay, to document every moment of what was quickly becoming a disaster. He scrawled a few more lines. The warriors are advancing in force. The men are holding steady, but the situation grows desperate. But even as he wrote, he knew that the tone of his notes was changing. This wasn't the story he had come to write. The victory he had envisioned was slipping away, replaced by something far darker. For the first time, the thought crossed Kellogg's mind that he might not make it out of the valley alive. He looked around at the soldiers, men who had been so sure of their strength just hours before, now firing in every direction, desperately trying to hold their ground. The warriors, too, had shifted their tactics. No longer content with distant skirmishes, they were charging directly into the lines, their numbers overwhelming the scattered troops. Kellogg could see their faces now, painted and fierce, their eyes burning with determination. His mule bucked nervously as the sounds of the battle intensified. He knew He needed to get closer to Custer if he wanted to survive, but the lines were already collapsing. The warriors had breached the perimeter, and Kellogg found himself on the wrong side of the conflict, trapped behind the rapidly shrinking line of soldiers. He spurred his mule forward, determined to reach the safety of Custer's command, but the chaos of the battlefield swallowed him up. In the moments that followed, Kellogg's notebook slipped from his hands, forgotten in the panic. The mule, sensing the danger, bolted, leaving Kellogg exposed in the open. He could hear the thundering of hooves behind him, the war cries growing louder. Turning, he saw them, dozens of warriors charging down the slope toward him, their rifles raised, arrows notched in their bows. He had only seconds to react, but in those final moments, he didn't think of his notebook or his story. He thought only of the inevitable. The first bullet struck his shoulder, sending him tumbling from the mule. He landed hard on the ground, the wind knocked from his lungs. The world spun around him, the sounds of battle deafening. He tried to crawl toward the soldiers, but another shot rang out, this one finding its mark in his chest. The pain was immediate, searing through his body, but there was no time to dwell on it. The warriors descended upon him in a blur of movement, and within moments, Kellogg's last report was finished. Back on Cemetery Ridge, Custer had not seen Kellogg fall. His focus was elsewhere, on the rapidly deteriorating situation around him. But in the back of his mind, he knew that the story Kellogg had come to write would never be told. The correspondent's pen had fallen silent, just as the battle itself was nearing its tragic conclusion. As the warriors closed in, the sounds of gunfire and battle began to blend into a chaotic blur. Custer's thoughts drifted for a moment, but then snapped back to the grim reality surrounding him. His men were falling fast, their desperate efforts to hold their ground unraveling with each passing second. There was no more time for memories, no more time for hope. This was the end, and he knew it. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it hard to see more than a few yards in any direction. Custer, still mounted on his horse, glanced around at the scene of utter chaos. His men were scattered across the ridge, some firing sporadically, others already lying motionless on the ground. The warriors, relentless in their pursuit, were closing the gap, their war cries growing louder as they pressed forward. Custer's command, which had once been a proud, tightly organized unit, was now a broken fragment of what it had been just hours earlier. His remaining troops were pinned down, barely able to return fire as the warriors closed in from all sides. The initial shock of being surrounded had turned into the grim acceptance of their fate. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no escape. Custer's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. How had it come to this? He had led his men into countless battles, and always before there had been a way out, a moment when victory seemed possible. But here, on this sun-baked ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn River, there was no path to safety. He had gambled everything on the speed and surprise of his attack, but now that gamble had failed. Looking around, Custer saw familiar faces, soldiers who had ridden with him through the thick of many battles. Some were still standing, firing their last rounds of ammunition. Others had already fallen, their bodies scattered across the dry, dusty ground. His brother, Tom Custer, was nearby, still fighting, refusing to give in despite the hopelessness of their situation. Custer's heart ached at the sight of him. He had brought his family, his friends, his comrades into this. And now they would all die together. A bullet whizzed past his ear, snapping him back to the immediacy of the moment. There was no more time for reflection. The warriors were upon them now, their numbers overwhelming. They advanced in waves, some on horseback, others on foot, firing arrows and rifles, their determination undiminished by the hours of battle. Custer fired his pistol at the nearest warrior, the shot hitting its mark, but it made no difference. There were too many. The line had broken completely. The soldiers who were still alive now fought in small pockets, huddling behind rocks or fallen horses, trying to fend off the warriors for just a few more minutes. But the outcome was inevitable. One by one, Custer's men fell until only a handful remained. The ridge that had once been the center of their defense was now a graveyard. Custer's horse stumbled beneath him, and he knew it was only a matter of time. He dismounted, pulling his pistol from its holster. His men were falling all around him, but still, he stood, determined to face the enemy head-on. There would be no retreat, no surrender. If this was the end, he would meet it with his head held high, fighting to the last. He could see the warriors now, just yards away, their faces painted, their eyes fierce with victory. One of them, a young Lakota warrior, locked eyes with Custer for a brief moment, a look of both defiance and respect passing between them. Custer raised his pistol, but before he could fire, an arrow struck him in the side, the impact knocking him to his knees. The pain was sharp but brief. As Custer fell, his mind registered the sound of one last gunshot, a final echo of the battle that had consumed the ridge. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness. In his final moments, he saw the faces of his men, those who had fought alongside him, those who had trusted him to lead them. And then silence. As the dust settled over the ridge, the battle was over. The warriors, victorious, stood among the fallen soldiers, their war cries now replaced with solemn silence. Custer, once the bold and brash commander of the Seventh Cavalry, lay motionless among his men, his last stand complete. With Custer and his men fallen, the once violent battlefield now lay eerily still. The sounds of war had faded, replaced by the low murmur of the victorious warriors moving among the remains. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ridge, the magnitude of the defeat became clear. The story of Custer's final moments would soon spread, not as a tale of triumph, but as a lesson in hubris and miscalculation. The following day, the battlefield was a somber sight. The Seventh Cavalry, once so confident in its strength, lay defeated, their bodies scattered across the valley and the ridge. The scene was grim. Soldiers and horses alike lay where they had fallen, their uniforms stained with the dust and blood of battle. For the warriors who had fought against them, it was a victory won not just through numbers, but through patience, strategy, and unity. In the days that followed, the news of Custer's defeat spread quickly across the country, carried by the few survivors of the battle who had been with Reno and Benteen, but far from the actual site of Custer's last stand. What had once been anticipated as a glorious victory over the Sioux and Cheyenne became a national shock, a devastating loss that would go down in history as one of the greatest military failures in the American West. As word of the battle reached Washington, D.C., and the East Coast, the initial reaction was one of disbelief. How could Custer, the golden-haired hero of the Civil War, have been defeated by a force of native warriors? The story, as it began to unfold, was more complex than anyone had anticipated. Custer had underestimated the strength and resolve of his enemies, and his decisions to split his forces and push forward without waiting for reinforcements had led to disaster. Reports from survivors and eyewitnesses painted a grim picture. The soldiers who had been left with Reno and Benteen had heard the distant gunfire from Custer's position, but had been too far away to provide any assistance. By the time they arrived at the scene of the battle, it was too late. Custer's men had been wiped out, their final stand marked by the bodies strewn across Cemetery Ridge and beyond. For the officers who surveyed the aftermath, the sight was sobering. The Native American warriors, meanwhile, had achieved a rare victory, one that would resonate within their communities for years to come. Leaders like Gall, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull had not only defended their people, but had delivered a blow to the U.S. Army that would be remembered for generations. This victory, however, would be bittersweet. The government's response to Custer's defeat would be swift and brutal, and the Sioux and Cheyenne would soon face even greater threats as the U.S. intensified its efforts to subdue them. Custer's reputation, once one of glory and fearlessness, would become tarnished by the events at Little Bighorn. His decisions on the battlefield would be scrutinized, debated, and criticized for years to come. Some would see him as a martyr, a bold commander who had taken a risk and paid the ultimate price. Others would see him as reckless, blinded by ambition and overconfidence, leading his men to an unnecessary and tragic end. Among the fallen was not just Custer, but his brothers, Tom and Boston, who had ridden into battle with him. Their deaths, along with the deaths of so many others, left a profound sense of loss in the hearts of those who had known and fought alongside them. The Seventh Cavalry, once seen as an unstoppable force, had been humbled in the most brutal way possible. As historians pieced together the details of the battle, the legacy of the defeat at Little Bighorn began to take shape. It became not just a story of a military blunder, but a symbol of the larger struggle between the U.S. government and the Native American tribes who fought to protect their lands and way of life. For the warriors who had stood their ground against Custer, it was a moment of defiance, one that would be remembered long after the dust had settled on the battlefield. Back east, newspapers began to print the details of the battle, often sensationalized to match the nation's shock. Headlines about Custer's last stand dominated the front pages, and the story took on a life of its own, with artists and writers romanticizing the tragic end of the Seventh Cavalry. But for those who had been there, who had seen the bodies of their comrades lying in the sun, the reality was far from romantic. The Battle of Little Bighorn would become a turning point, not just for the U.S. Army, but for the Native American tribes as well. It was a fleeting victory, but one that demonstrated the strength, courage, and unity of the Sioux and Cheyenne peoples in the face of overwhelming odds. And for Custer, it was the end of a career defined by daring and ultimately by defeat. As the sun set on the quiet valley, the ridge where Custer had made his last stand remained still, a haunting reminder of the cost of hubris. The land, once filled with the sounds of battle, had fallen silent, the echoes of that fateful day slowly fading into history.